All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to give it just a second for folks to trickle in. If you are joining, feel free to hop in the chat and introduce yourself to the other folks who are signing on today. We encourage people to communicate amongst themselves. And also, please use the Q&A feature if you have questions for any of the panelists throughout the presentation. We'll probably answer most of them via chat or by text during the presentation and handle some at the end in the discussion section. I'm just going to kick it right off in the interest of time. Hi, all. Welcome. My name is Drew Magliozzi. I'm the CEO and co-founder at AdmitHub, and I want to thank you all for making time amid a very hectic schedule to attend today. Today, I'm joined by two extraordinary guests to share some exciting research results. We'll also shine a light on some student insights and key actions for enrollment leaders, particularly in this time of crisis in the emerging COVID situation. I'm grateful, obviously, to have both guests here today. I'll let them introduce themselves because they'll do a much better job than I will. Maybe Tim, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Tim Renick. I'm the Senior Vice President for Student Success at Georgia State University in Atlanta.
Thank you, Tim. And Lindsay, would you mind doing the honors?
Hi, everybody. Lindsay Page. It looks on the slide like I got promoted. I'm an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the School of Education here. And most of my research is in the space of college access and success, and have just been delighted by contributing or collaborating with both Drew and Tim, so I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you both. Most of the conversation will happen from their side during this presentation. The main event, as I mentioned at the outset of today's webinar, is the randomized controlled trial we conducted together starting in the 2018-2019 academic year at Georgia State. To measure the effect of conversational AI on some of the key behaviors that lead students to have momentum through college, with the ultimate success measure being persistence year to year. Lindsay Page will share the detail of our research study, but first, given the COVID crisis that we're facing today, we felt it was prudent to let Tim kick things off with an overview of Georgia State's operations and how their innovative practices to foster student success, frankly, are more important than ever in the current situation. After Tim and Lindsay, I'll share some additional insights that we've surfaced with our platform by holding more than 250,000 conversations with students since the crisis began just over a month ago. And then finally, we'll have a discussion, further detail about how to retain students in this time of crisis. We'd love to address your questions at that time as well. Again, throughout the presentation, we'll be sprinkling in some quick polls to the audience. So please, if you see something pop up, answer the question so we can better understand what's on your minds. This is a two-way street, and we'd love to listen as much as broadcast what we have to share. And obviously, if you have questions, please use the Zoom Q&A tool or the chat. We'd love to address those at the end of the presentation as well. So thank you very much. Without further ado, Tim, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Drew. Yeah, I'm going to say a little bit about where Georgia State stands amidst the COVID circumstances and connect it to some of the initiatives we've been noted for over the last decade. You know, Georgia State is a distinct institution. We're a very large urban university. We have about 54,000 students right in the middle of downtown Atlanta. We're one of the largest minority serving schools in the country. And I think some of our distinctiveness is both a challenge and an advantage at this particular moment. Next slide. One of the challenges we're facing is our distinct student body is in many ways the first group hit by the economic downturn. So, you know, we are a campus that has no majority population. About 75% of our students are non-white. Our largest single group are African-American students, about 39%. We also have one of the largest Pell populations in the country. This spring semester, just under 29,000 Pell students are enrolled at Georgia State. 85% of our students are working, or I guess I should say were working, because many of these were the first to lose their jobs over the last few weeks. In downtown Atlanta, the hospitality industry is #1, restaurants, hotels, conventions, and so forth. And many of these jobs, as you well know, were the first to go. So our students are feeling a lot of challenges right now as we, like every other university, has transitioned to entirely online classes. But I want to be a little more upbeat than just that scenario by pointing out that a number of the investments that we and some of your campuses have made over the last decade have proven extremely helpful under these circumstances. If you go to the next slide. One of the investments we've made at Georgia State is something we call GPS advising. This is the analytics-based proactive advising approach. Next. About 10 years ago, we began a big data project to try to identify which students were dropping out of Georgia State before they dropped out. We used 10 years of data, 140,000 student records. We were looking for any statistical evidence of students whose behavior correlated to them dropping or flunking out of the university. We found over 800 markers that indicated a risk of a statistically significant sort. Some of these were simple things like students registering for the wrong classes. Other things were more complicated, like the screen you're looking at right now. This is our use of predictive analytics in a kind of elementary way. We're looking at first grades a student take in their major and the correlation between that first grade and their chances of graduating. What we found, if you look at political science in the center of the screen, is that many times students who pass courses are still at extreme academic risk. A student who gets a C in their first political science course and wants to be a political science major is only graduating from Georgia State as a 25% clip. 75% are not succeeding. And in the past, we did nothing with these students. What Georgia State has kind of gotten noted for over the last decade is this approach to tracking students for these 800 risk factors every day and reaching out proactively. In fact, if you look at the next slide, over the last 12 months alone across Georgia State's campuses, we've had over 100,000 proactive interactions with students where advisors have reached out to students based on alerts coming out of our predictive analytics system. Well, how does that connect to the current moment? If you look at the next slide, what we did in the week before we launched entirely online, which was in the middle of March, is develop some new alerts. One of the alerts we've developed, you're seeing kind of represented graphically on this chart, is we're looking at logins to our iCollege, our LMS learning management system, the platform we're using to deliver the vast majority of our online classes. And what we're able to do is track students on a day-to-day basis, whether they're logging in or not. Many campuses perhaps can have those data points, but what we've been able to do is leverage the investment we've made in advising and tracking platforms to connect these alerts directly to our advisors. So each evening as we're running these sorts of data, we're connecting them directly to the advisor who's assigned to the student. And as you can see from this slide, in the first 2 weeks we were back with the entirely online instruction, we had over 8,000 one-on-one meetings between our students and advisors. This was possible because our students are so busy and so many have jobs. We already were using tele-advising as a major tool, video advising. And 3,000 of those outreaches were specifically a result of this new analytic, this new alert that we created to identify students who were not logging on to their classes. The results, if you go to the next slide, have been encouraging. So I'm not sure what to expect under a circumstance where there is no precedent, but these data are, I think, encouraging. What they show, if you look to the the column on the far right, is what percent of the unique students in each of these categories is logging on to their online classes during an average week. And last week, for instance, among our bachelor students across Georgia State, over 98%, almost 98.5% of the students were logging on. So we think there is a correlation between the proactive outreach we're doing and the kind of responsiveness we're seeing from our students. Second example on the next slide is our Panther Retention Grant Program. You know, about 8 years ago, we flipped our financial aid awarding on its ear. Previously, most awards to students were the result of students identifying a self-need. They would come in, they would fill out an application. In fact, it was almost impossible to get aid from Georgia State unless a student filled out a FAFSA or some other kind of financial aid application. If you go to the next slide, what we started doing 7 or 8 years ago is designing a program that was far more proactive and data-based. We have a lot of data about our students. We know their unmet need levels. We know their estimated family contribution. We know which students haven't paid their bills or have holds on their account for financial reasons. And what we started doing initially at the small scale is just putting micro grants in the students' accounts to resolve whatever issue we were identifying in our data. First semester, we helped about 40 students. Now we're helping up to 3,000 students a year via this program. And if you go to the next slide, what we found is it's a very efficient way of delivering institutional aid to students. For an average grant of about $900, we've been able to get about 87% of the students graduated who receive these grants. And as a result of that, we've given over 17,000 of these grants out over the last 7 or 8 years. Okay, if you go to the next slide, I will connect this to the COVID situation, because all of us, I think on this phone call, are facing a challenge right now. We have CARES Act money coming to us, and we have stipulations from the Secretary of Education. In Georgia State's case, we have $22 million that we need to distribute to students, but we've told we have to do it directly to the students, so we have to provide them with cash or credit directly in their accounts. We need to do it immediately, right? We can't wait weeks or months. They need the money now, and that was a stipulation to get the money to the students as quickly as possible. And the Secretary of Education advised that we not distribute equal amounts to every student, that we award the grants based upon the levels of needs of our students. Well, how do you respond to that circumstance? You can try to get students to send in applications, but you'll only get applications from the most engaged students. And it will be a very long process, so students will only be getting their aid weeks or even months into the future. Instead, what Georgia State is doing this week, as the CARES Act money is coming to us from the federal government, is distributing just under 25,000 grants over one 24-hour period based upon the same kind of analytics and metrics that we've been using as part of our Panther retention grant program. Next slide. The third and final example I'm going to cite, and then this is going to lead into Lindsay's discussion of our RCT, is our use of a chatbot. At Georgia State, the chatbot is known as Pounce. Next slide. This is a new tool we introduced in 2016, an AI-enhanced communication platform, which has a knowledge base as we launched it with about 2,000 vetted and prepared answers to commonly asked students questions. Now we're up to, I think, closer to 4,000 answers in the knowledge base. And students have the ability to 24/7 text in a question and get an immediate response. Next. In many ways, this platform is built on the same principles of the FAQs all of us have had on our university websites for the last 2 decades. Simple questions, I need to park on campus, and we might be able to respond via the FAQ, are you coming every day or not, and give them a simple answer. But what the AI-enhanced chatbot has been able to do at Georgia State is conduct true conversations with students to help them resolve problems. If you look at the next slide, this is the actual visual depiction of what our sequencing looks like when a student asks a question about the FAFSA. And depending on their answer about whether they are on Pell or not, or a dependent student or not, they get taken through a whole series of conversations. The other side of the chatbot is not just answering questions that the students have, but if you go to the next slide, prompting the students to deal with matters that we know about, but doing so through the efficiency of a text. We've been using text to communicate with students who are enrolled at Georgia State to try to promote their retention. And what we're able to do using our data sets is deliver very personalized campaigns to the students where we're mentioning their names, but the names of their advisors and other people supporting them, and their very specific circumstances, like a student who has a hold on their account for a financial reason. Next slide. These early alert nudges have been extremely effective, as Lindsay is going to talk about, in getting students to access resources that were in the past only accessed by a small number or a low percentage of students. Again, the students are getting these messages directly on their texting platform. They're not going onto an app. They're just on their texting platform, seeing these texts pop up. because they're connected to our data sets, we're communicating with the students personally, directing them to particular coaches, academic coaches, advisors, and so forth. Next slide. So what is the connection here? Well, we've been deploying the chatbot in some really interesting ways over the last few weeks to help us through the COVID circumstance. One of our crises early on was the governor of the state of Georgia and then the university system gave us a dictate over with really no advance warning that we had to find out from all our students living in university housing which students could move home immediately and which students were going to have to stay on campus. And so we conducted that very evening that the governor's dictate came out, a campaign using Pounce, our chatbot, to try to get this information from students. Interestingly, at the same time, we sent the same group of students an email. The email was opened by about 15% of the students. The question that came through on the chatbot, which was more than just a information item as the email was, but allowed the students to indicate whether or not they were staying on campus, and if they were leaving campus, it allowed them to sign up for a time to move out of their dormitories, because we had to do that in a coordinated fashion that would be meet safety requirements and so forth. Well, you can see the results right there in front of you. We got 87% of the students to give us their responses through the chatbot. And I'll tell you, in the first 14 or so minutes, we had something like 30% of the responses. So this was a way of cutting through the clutter, allowing students to give us personalized information in a very specific fashion and in a very timely way when, given the crisis in front of us, time was of the absolute essence. And so we've been evolving our use of the chatbot over the last 2 years from a tool that was purely for helping freshmen through the admission cycle to one now that there are over 20,000 students every day at Georgia State who are using and have access to the chatbot to help them navigate retention issues. And with that, I think I'm going to turn things over to Lindsay.
Terrific. Thanks, Tim, so much. As Tim mentioned, we have been collaborating together on using Pounce to support students even before they get onto the GSU campus. So I'll talk very quickly about the first study that we collaborated on together, focused on Summer Melt. And I will just say, from a research standpoint, this work was exciting for me in particular because prior to this study, we had strong theories about what was happening with students over the summer and why they might, even college intending students might fail to make the transition to college. But working together with GSU really allowed me to sort of test those hypotheses. And it was very exciting. It continues to be exciting to collaborate on a tool that works so well in reaching students. So in this first summer, we worked together to put together, as Tim indicated, a set of text messages to reach out to students through Pounce to remind students, if they needed that reminder, about every task that they needed to be completing in order to matriculate to GSU on time. As you can see on the slide here, this outreach led to positive outcomes on getting students at higher rates to do things like attend orientation, submit their documentation related to immunizations and their transcripts. It reduced students being held up in accessing financial aid, both because students were less likely to be held up in a cycle of FAFSA verification. They were also more likely to complete their loan counseling and accept their loans. In the past, students had been hung up in particular on these financial aid related tasks. And as you can see from the results here, there's dramatic improvement in helping students to access their financial aid by being more proactive in reaching out to students, reminding them what they need to be doing, and then providing them help and support if they need that follow-up help and support. All of these positive outcomes culminated in a higher share of GSU intending students successfully matriculating. If you go to the next slide.
Hey, Lindsay, can I interject one quick thing?
Please.
Perhaps I oftentimes encounter folks who aren't familiar with what an RCT is. Would you mind?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Invite me any day to talk about an RCT. So One thing that was important for me, and I think should be important for the field, is really making sure when we invest in tools like this, that we ask hard questions about whether it's worth it for our institutions to spend resources on spending resources, both dollars, staff time, in implementing these tools and implementing them well. And so when we began this collaboration, I felt really strongly about studying the implementation of Pounce in first this summer melt context through a randomized controlled trial, where what we did was essentially identify all of the students who could be eligible for outreach through Pounce. And then we flipped a coin and said, okay, for this cycle, half of the students who are eligible or who would qualify to receive this outreach are going to get it. And we're going to withhold from half of the students, and then we'll compare outcomes. And so the results that you see on this slide are the results based on that experimental study. And so this and RCTs are really considered sort of gold standard for asking the hard questions about cause and effect, and asking the hard questions about whether this kind of investment would be worth it, and whether it's really shaping and changing outcomes in a positive direction for students. And so by studying the implementation of Pounce in the summer melt context within the framework of an RCT, we were really able to understand whether this was having positive outcomes for students. And indeed, the answer is yes. For those of you who love research as much as I do, or more, if that's possible, we do have an academic paper that we've written up on this, and it's freely available online, and I'm sure I would be glad to have folks access that. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So building on that first study, seeing the positive effect of Pounce on supporting GSU intending students to get to campus in the fall, where we turned to next was really thinking about how we could use this tool to better support students once they were on campus. And if we think that the transition to college is messy and confusing, and there are many ways where students can get off track, that those issues are sort of, raised to many powers harder once you think about supporting students to persist all the way through to a degree. So in this slide, you see a sort of graphic representation of the many different things that students need to be navigating and thinking about. And so next with the chatbot, what GSU turned to was thinking about how to use the chatbot to support students primarily outside of their classes, actually. If we think about student success in college, there's a lot that students need to be doing in their academic classes, but there are many administrative processes that students need to be handling. And there are also other supports outside of their classes that can help students to make progress. And so where the university turned next was using the chatbot to better support students, be proactive in reaching out to students about various administrative processes like FAFSA filing or refiling, particularly if students had things like registration holds on their records, so they weren't able to register for classes, or if they had an unpaid portion of their bill. The university very successfully used the tool to raise those issues with students in a timely way. And I want to really give credit to a fantastic team of folks that Tim has at GSU who organized this work and carried out this work so beautifully. I can take no credit for that, but I'm honored to talk about it now. The outreach also addressed things like supplemental academic supports, reminding students to be meeting with their advisors, reminding them about other resources that are available to them on campus, like supplemental instruction, fairs that have to do with selecting a major. And then there were supplemental, what we labeled as non-academic supports, particularly things through the Career Services Office, things like job and internship fairs, career fairs, graduate and professional school fairs. So if we go ahead to the next slide, you can see here just some examples of the types of messages that went out to students. The messages in the first column relate to those sort of administrative requirements. If you read some of those messages, you'll see that there is a sort of an acuity to them. Oftentimes the outreach was going to students to raise awareness that there was something that they really needed to pay attention to very soon, or else their ability to continue on successfully as a student might be hindered. In the middle, you see other messages related to things like maintaining satisfactory academic progress. And then finally, in the column on the right, also messages about academic advising. So again, just some examples to provide to you. If you go to the next slide, you'll see again that what we found, we continued to study the tool through the context of an RCT, again, continuing to ask the question about whether this is going to be worthwhile, and to really study in real time what is being successful, what is not being successful, so that the university can be in a virtuous cycle of learning how to do this work and do it better. And so what we found was that the outreach was helpful in improving student outcomes, sort of process outcomes, as you see here, on a variety of different dimensions. I will say in particular, and I think that this relates to the current crisis that we are all experiencing, in particular, when the outreach went to students to signal issues of high, again, I'll use the word acuity, issues that really needed to be handled in the moment. This form of communication was highly, highly effective at raising students' awareness of issues that they needed to be attending to and getting students the support that they needed in order to attend to those issues. So when you see things like on the far left of the slide, opening financial aid cases, these were for students who, for example, still had an unpaid portion of their tuition bill. And I couple that with the second results on students withdrawing because of balances. By virtue of Pounce reaching out to students on issues related to their student bill and finances, a significant share of students were saved really from having to withdraw because of having those balances on their record. Finally, on the right-hand side of the slide, I really see this plus 5% on FAFSA refiling and fall term registration as a strong indication that messaging to students on these kinds of topics, helping them navigate these types of administrative tasks, is a piece of the puzzle for helping students to persist in college at higher rates. So that plus 5% is sort of a culminating result that is particularly exciting to me. So we can go ahead on to the next slide.
Oh, Lindsay, thank you. Before we dive into the, obviously the COVID insights, which I'm about to share, I just wanted to make sure if anyone's interested in learning more, there's going to be a little poll that pops up. Feel free to indicate yes or no. And Lindsay, can you share, I realize that maybe it's worth noting the one asterisk on the research study, which is that it was ended a little bit early.
Yes. Yeah. In clinical trial research, there's a notion
we're all familiar with right now.
That is true. There's a term that I think is really useful here, and that term is equipoise. That from an ethical standpoint, we feel okay running clinical trials, running experiments, as long as we feel as though for whatever the two things are that we're comparing in our experiment, we're in a state of equipoise. That is, we truly don't know if one is better than the other. And the result here on the plus 5% was a result that we saw, I believe this was the sort of end of July result, that we saw that by the end of July, those in the treatment group were 5% more likely to be registered for the fall term, more so than those in the control group. And given all of the results that we had seen throughout the academic year and that sort of culminating result, In truth, Tim and his team could no longer be in a state of equipoise. That is, they had enough evidence to suggest that really using this kind of tool to support and communicate with all of their students was what the university should be doing. And so it was at that point that they decided to sort of close out our experiment. So we didn't have the chance to follow the students experimentally all the way into the subsequent fall. But still from the work that we had done up to that point, they felt as though they had strong evidence to make that decision.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Lindsay.
and Drew, I'll just mention that I'm a practitioner, right? I'm not somebody who is a researcher of student success research. So when I see something that works, we make the decision that all students will benefit. And I should underline, Lindsay mentioned earlier, as we launched in 2016, that we withheld the chatbot from some students. We didn't withhold a tool that had any proven evidence that it was going to work and be effective. We were your first post-secondary partner, and we were withholding in part because we didn't want to scale something that we were unsure what the impact might be, and there was some small chance it might have been a negative impact. So it was a very different dynamic than more recently.
And I just saw one question come up on the chat, so I'll just answer it quickly. So the Summer Melt results are already published and out in the world. The persistence results will be out soon. I have been, the current situation has slowed me down a little bit, but coming in the next couple of weeks.
Ooh, that's good news. I learned things on this webinar. Thank you so much, Tim and Lindsay. I'll dive into some quick insights that we've learned, as I mentioned, over the past month or so, analyzing approximately 250,000 conversations that we've had with students using the chatbots that we use at about 150 institutions of higher education, as well as some government agency websites. In fact, before diving too far into this, I wanted to acknowledge my team. They've done an extraordinary effort, first calling attention to the crisis, and really in approximately 72 hours, devising, building, and launching a chatbot, infusing with all of our partners some knowledge about the COVID crisis, as well as launching a specific COVID-oriented bot free to the market for anyone who wants to use it, with knowledge base populated with CDC and WHO information and vetted by medical professionals. Again, that's 100% free. It's available to embed on a website. It comes with support for 100 different languages. And if you're interested, we'll drop a link in the chat for anyone who wants to request a free account. But moving on, what we learned was truly astounding. I often refer to our platform as a tool for listening at scale as much as broadcasting. And never before has the ability to listen, respond, and observe trends been more relevant than it is today. So the source of our insight for this industry report is more than 250,000 conversations that we've had with our bots via text message, social media, and web chat. And sentiment has ranged the full spectrum of emotion, from fear and anxiety to hope and gratitude. Actually, an abundance of gratitude, which is really uplifting to see. Engagement data is still streaming in, so this is really just a snapshot. And of course, the trending topics will continue to shift and evolve over time as we continue toward the fall 2020 enrollment. Also, in the interest of time, I'm going to move pretty quickly through this, but know that anyone who's attending will send out a recording of this webinar, and we'll also be releasing a detailed insights report with much more data at the end of May, and anyone who attends will get access to that. So thank you and stay tuned. So in the first 2 weeks of the outbreak, and these trends graphs are volume of questions as they've changed over time, which is really fascinating. So in the first 2 weeks of the outbreak, most of the concern that was coming in was around testing and treatment on campus, as you might imagine. But as people went home, those questions naturally declined about campus safety. And actually what tended to emerge was a new trend in mental health. And we have some snapshots of some of the questions, specific verbatim, that students have asked about, what happens if their roommate needs to get tested, Can I still get access to counseling services? What are some precautions I can take? And frankly, I'm feeling sad because of this whole virus thing. How should I take it? I can't concentrate on my classes, but I cannot fail. It's really been an astounding sort of just trend line that we've seen about people first experiencing this crisis and then all the knock-on effects. And actually, Tim, I realize this is my part of the presentation and I'm nearly deferring work, but I wonder if some of these trends that we're showing here, many of us map to the data from Georgia State's Chatbot, also align to some of the experiences day to day that your team is seeing.
Yeah, absolutely, Drew. We had expected that some of our services or access to the services would drop off a bit in at least frequency once we went entirely online, but we have not seen that to be the case. So I already mentioned that, you know, students are accessing their academic advisors at about just the same rate as beforehand. The same is true for our counselors. In fact, there's been an uptick in some categories. We have dedicated counselors helping with abusive situations and so forth. We've actually seen an uptick in students accessing help in some of those circumstances, obviously, because many of these individuals are now at home on a much more regular basis. And we've seen a lot of referrals through other means. So I think this group should know that we have certain words that if a student signals in a chatbot, will immediately go to our Dean of Students office and somebody will reach out personally to that student if, for instance, they mention harming themselves and so forth. We've also been using our applications for emergency aid with a similar purpose. So students who are applying for emergency aid often reveal things about their mental health and well-being, or their living circumstances for that matter. And we've connected over 200 students to emotional and psychological counselors since this crisis began, not because the student first thought that's what they needed, but because one of these other platforms signaled to us that they might benefit from the service.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, absolutely. And while even the mental health requests are a small volume of inquiries, they've increased about triple. And still, when we're talking about, at least in our case, our company has reached about 2 million students, an actual very sizable number of individuals. So you can go to the next slide, Laura. Listening at scale obviously lets you understand the impact of these types of issues on a student body, and it also allows you to identify the students who are at risk and need attention, just like you were talking about, Tim. And some of these are fascinating. Again, small issues, but truly what we've seen, these diamonds in the rough. And our technology has been able to see time and again that it's quite good at providing students a low pressure way to seek help. To say something like, I can't afford a computer, or I don't have Wi-Fi. What do I do without a laptop? We've also seen, you know, obviously these are, again, about small numbers, but sizable number of students in our data set. About 6,000 students have asked questions on these trends. Similarly, we've seen a lot of folks ask about childcare. Our daycare is open. We've had about almost 400 questions about how to take care of children. I have 2 children who have no public school childcare. Like, how do I handle this situation? I can empathize because I do have also 2 children, and I'm shocked they haven't stormed into this room. So I'm grateful for anyone who can help take them off their hands. I couldn't imagine being a full-time college student at this time as well. And Tim, you and I have discussed this in depth, but obviously Georgia State is exceptionally good at identifying the specific needs of vulnerable student segments and addressing them. We've done a great deal of work on this. In fact, you also mentioned specifically with student workers. I want to give you a chance to talk about that question right there verbatim in the middle about how you are handling the student workers that you employ and the needs that they face.
Yeah, another good question. You know, some of us had taken the attitude at the beginning of this crisis that all these students that we employ no longer have a job or no longer have the responsibilities they once had. And if anything, what we've discovered over the last 4 or 5 weeks is that those sorts of student employees are more important than ever. So the jobs have changed and morphed in many ways. We had 140 resident advisors. So they were responsible for being on the floors with the students. These were mostly graduate students or advanced undergraduates who went through training and were part of our support system at Georgia State. Well, clearly, when most of the students have moved out of the dormitories, which is the case, we're still housing several hundred, but most of our students have gone home. We don't have the need for 140 students to sit on each floor and watch what's going on. In fact, we've consolidated our students into just a couple buildings on campus and so forth. But did their need diminish under these circumstances? Quite the contrary. What we've done with our resident advisors, for instance, is continue to keep them on the payroll, but now they're conducting virtual communities of the floor that they once, monitored on a physical basis. So there was a community that was established on many of these floors, lots of friendships and contacts and so forth. How can we keep those going, and how can we keep those supports going even when students are scattered, all over the place geographically? Our supplemental instructors are more important now than ever, because in addition to students having content questions about the courses that they're taking, they also are struggling with dealing with the new modalities and dealing with technologies and so forth. And many times it's the fellow undergraduates who have the better insights. So we've made the strong argument at Georgia State, and our president has been very receptive to it. This is not the opportunity for us to cut away those positions. Those kind of support systems become all the more critical in a time of transition and tumult like we're going through right now.
Thank you, Tim. Next slide, Laura. So of course, we've seen plenty of questions about finances and paying for college. This should come as no surprise to anyone. And while initially the questions were about, can I get a refund? They've started, those have started to abate, but the rising concern about payment and fees and a very disconcerting increase in students expressing concerns and speculating that they may withdraw. These are troubling and obviously need to be addressed, and I think can be addressed adequately by getting in front of situations and listening to those students and getting them the information they need, ideally before they even realize they need it. You can go to the next slide, Laura. And though, again, this is a fascinating bit of insight we've been seeing as the trend to virtual classrooms has transitioned immediately. There have been tons of questions about students speculating and worrying about grades being moved to pass-fail and grades in general, their own academic status. We've also seen the logistics of the virtual classroom, as you noted, Tim, with login behavior, have 2x'd in the last 5 weeks, as well as a great deal of concern about what to do for lab-based or other accreditation programs that are typically not done in a traditional classroom, and how those might be handled. And frankly, there's so much uncertainty abounding about how campuses are going to address these problems that seems to be percolating among the students as they, a few other outlets other than to type a question into their smartphone. We have a few key recommendations about how a school might be able to address this coming into the fall of 2020. From our data, it's suggesting that students are deeply concerned about the idea of a fully virtual college experience in the fall, but they're equally concerned with their health and safety, pretending that it's business as usual, going back to campus in September. And really, it looks like a balanced approach that manages the blend between virtual and the in-person experience is going to be essential for helping students really feel their feet under them come the fall. Maybe next slide, Laura. Again, we have a bunch of data here that we are continuing to crunch daily, and this is the full breakdown of what students are asking us across every topic vector in those 250,000 conversations. But really the biggest concern on their minds are safety, academics, finances, and frankly, a general uncertainty about whether the in-person experience is going to happen in the fall. Next slide, Laura, if you don't mind. So these are a few of the sort of distilled recommendations that the data seems to be suggesting to us, and I wanted to run these by you in particular, Tim. One, make COVID-19 campus safety policies clear and accessible to returning students. As you mentioned, email is not the most reliable method for getting anything in front of the eyes of a teenager or young adult. And so doing whatever you can do possibly, perhaps a chatbot, but at least texting is a good avenue, whether it's AI powered or not, to get this student's information into their eyeballs as frequently as possible, frankly, over communicating as much as you can. Also, to the degree possible that you can encourage help-seeking behavior to identify struggling students quickly. Virtual counseling solutions should be extended to students who are unable to return to campus or are having trouble meeting counselors in person. Tim, you already talked extensively about this. And then obviously a modified campus experience for the most vulnerable students who don't have the resources, space, or environment at home to learn effectively. Or for instance, who have those laboratory courses or practicums that they must complete to adequately get a degree. And finally, clarity around what the academic year will look like, painting that picture with as vivid a brush as possible to explain how you can, at the very least, begin to approximate the in-person experience with some social distancing, safety, and obviously as much fidelity for education as possible. These are small suggestions, some easier to incorporate than others, but Tim, I wanted to get your general sense about these and whether you had anything to add, because this is sort of what is emerging to us, and obviously more information will continue to emerge.
Yeah, I think these are good insights, Drew. Not surprising since they're coming from the students themselves. I'll make a couple observations. One is that the clarity issue is very real for Georgia State right now. Surprisingly, we are up in enrollments for summer semester. So we're tracking about 800 students ahead, even though we've announced that we'll be entirely online for summer. For fall, we're right now tracking behind because I think in part there isn't that clarity. We don't yet have the ability to say this is exactly how things will work. And so I think you're right that I think the students are seeking some sense of what this is going to look like before they make the plunge and commit. The other observation is, and it supports the bullet points that you have in front of us, Georgia State has invested a lot in delivering personalized services to students via technology. And as I emphasized in my comments, that's been very useful now because students are not meeting with anybody face-to-face. They can't raise their hand and speak to an advisor, at least in the physical sense and so forth. So these proactive approaches have been very useful. But the flip side of what Georgia State has been committed to over the last decade is delivering, especially to underserved students and students who otherwise would be at risk of dropping out, very personalized experiences, mindset, communities, special academies and so forth, where we bring the students together closely and they bond and they get to experience post-secondary life in a very different fashion than previously. Those have been very effective for us, but we're really struggling now with how to deliver those. So one of our signature programs is a Success Academy in the summer, where our analytics show certain students are at greater risk of dropping out. We bring those students in advance. They spend the summer with us. We do field trips with them. We do bonding experiences and so forth. And we are now working on a plan to try to deliver some of those services, but entirely online, synchronously and so forth, but online. And how we deliver the technology these students need and all these other issues have really complicated matters. So we are very concerned that we do not want the equity gaps to return because of this circumstance. And we need to do everything we can to serve those who have the least amount of resources.
I was about to ask that very question, Tim. I remember Success Academies being such a key part, and new student orientation in general. How, particularly from the summer melt interventions that we did, getting students to attend those was key. How are you thinking about orientation broadly for the summer session if students can't come to campus?
Yeah, well, we've been pretty much told by our university system that we're not going to have face-to-face meetings this summer, which tells us that orientation will not be face-to-face. What we've been trying to think through is ways to make it meaningful emotionally as well as from an information perspective. And we've already piloted a couple of these with some special events we've hosted over the last couple of weeks. So one thing we're doing is we're sending students a packet in advance. They will get t-shirts and so forth, and they can show up to orientation, you know, branded appropriately and hopefully enthused, at least in that respect. We are holding orientations on a specific day. There is a model that we could just, you know, roll out a packaged program and students could sign on whenever they'd like. That's not the model we're using. It's going to be a virtual orientation, but it's not pre-packaged. During the orientation day, students will have breakout meetings with advisors. They will get a personalized schedule. They will be able to talk about whether their course schedule has problems or any issues with it. Similarly with the financial side of things, students, we are going to pre-package and pre-arrange a course schedule for every student before they arrive on the day they've signed up for, but then have conversations with the students about whether they need to make adaptations and so forth. We've tried this a couple times already and found that there's extremely high participation rates in some of these synchronous experiences where the students are interacting with real people, able to ask real questions and so forth. So, you know, that will be the model we go for orientation this coming summer. It's not the same as what we're doing. There'll be no, you know, branded cupcakes and all those sorts of things that we've done in the past. But we're hoping to have the students feel some kind of emotional connection.
Thank you, Tim. Before we go on to more discussion in Q&A, I see some wonderful questions here open on the Q&A. Laura, thank you. You advanced the slide. I wanted to quickly insert a public service announcement from my team, which is that in this moment of crisis and perhaps the most challenging summer that higher ed has faced in quite a while, we're introducing what we're calling Ollie for All. And Ollie is our company's mascot or our chatbot. And this program is going to be made completely free for any institution that's interested this summer, where we will send text message reminders to your students about things that we are seeing in the data that they need help with. This is a bit different than what Tim described with Pounce, which had a vast knowledge base about university-specific details and was highly tailored to the Georgia State experience. What we'd be offering for free is more of the research-backed nudges and strategies that we have tested, but more on a general basis than a highly specified basis for the school. Additionally, these tips and tricks and practices will help students find financial resources, staying mentally and physically well as they navigate this path to a virtual or blended classroom experience in the fall. And again, this is purpose-built to help people, institutions solve the top challenges that students are identifying in the COVID bot situations that we're analyzing. Also, schools who choose to participate will make it as easy as possible because we know everyone has an enormous burden on their shoulders. So all you have to do is share student names and cell phone numbers, and we'll take it from there. Each institution will also receive a monthly pulse report sharing the insights and data from their students, how they're engaging, what sentiments, questions, concerns, and a whole bunch more are coming up. Essentially, we're here to help, and we're offering this priority setup for anyone who's on today. So if you're interested, you can click the yes or no, and we will gladly help you get set up. After that brief infomercial interlude, let's get into the discussion because Tim and Lindsay, I have a few further follow-up questions based on some of the things we've talked about already. And maybe I'll start with you, Lindsay. You always have several research initiatives up your sleeve. in various stages of development. And I wonder if you could give the audience a glimpse into some plans, either potentially getting the band back together with this group or
Absolutely.
elsewhere. Yeah.
Absolutely. This band is never breaking up as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, building on the persistence work that that I had the opportunity to talk about, one thing that I recognize about it is that it was really on the periphery of students' core academic work as students in college. And I am particularly interested in understanding how a tool like Pounce or, you know, a chatbot type tool can profitably be, well, profitable is the wrong word, can fruitfully be integrated into students' core academic experiences. And so the next place that I'm interested to push is understanding how, you know, I'm a faculty member myself, I teach classes, I work very hard to stay engaged with my students and to help them stay on track in my course. And so I'm very interested in moving forward in bringing this kind of tool into the classroom experience. Both, you know, you can imagine it being a study tool for students if you can incorporate a Q&A kind of functionality, as well as helping students stay on top of their tasks and deadlines.
Thank you, Lindsay.
And Lindsay and Drew, I have an update even since we talked last, that we've gotten some funding internal to Georgia State to create some Khan Academy-like targeted videos for some courses that have high DFW rates, so that, you know, students who struggle with a particular concept in microeconomics will have some money to put together a little video to take them through that. And our main thought about how we're going to deliver that information is the chatbot, because obviously the chatbot can't explain deep and long concepts via text. What we need are these tools that the chatbot can connect students to. So we now have some money to do that this fall.
Awesome. Great. Pounce Academy.
Yeah,
I love it.
Absolutely.
That's great news, Tim. Thank you. Actually, Tim, maybe this next question is better for you too. Lindsay obviously shared some of the key areas that we nudge students on. And a lot of that data came from you. I mean, you were kind enough to share the insights that you had derived from all of your data about the behaviors that you felt drove momentum from year to year for students. But I know the things we nudged students on for this research study was not the full comprehensive experience. Are there any other factors that you would want to deploy the chatbot or have since deployed the chatbot to an effective use?
Yeah, the answer is open-ended, and I think that's a positive in the sense that what we've done is look at problems that we're having trouble resolving with regard to student behavior, right? Yeah. You know, one example Lindsay did talk about is getting students to complete FAFSAs. That's an annual struggle, is to get those done and to get those done in a timely fashion. And so we built up a chatbot campaign around that. And, you know, a few weeks ago, I couldn't have anticipated that I would need to figure out a chatbot campaign on how to get students out of university housing all over a 3 or 4 day period while observing social distancing and so forth. But that emerged in that context. But Lindsay has her finger on where we think the next frontier is, which is, you know, the students now at Georgia State by the tens of thousands are picking up their chatbot and asking all kinds of questions about navigating campus. How can we help the students navigate the academics? And my vision is not they go to some other tool or some other platform for that. If they're already talking to Pounce and Pounce has helped them, you know, complete the FAFSA and help them schedule an appointment with their advisor, why shouldn't Pounce also help them get through microeconomics? So that's where I think we are heading, where this tool will be not, Georgia State will not have a virtual academic advisor and Pounce. Georgia State will have a tool that provides all these services.
Thank you. There are a few other logistical things, and given we have a short amount of time, maybe we answer them quickly. I'll tackle the Q&A ones, and I think Tim, or these might mostly be directed at you. The first question is, who wrote the messages that Pounce said? Who's the puppet master? And do campuses have the opportunity to review and revise messaging if they use the product?
Yeah, so for us, we worked especially initially very closely with the AdmitHub team, but now we've got a team at Georgia State, as Lindsay indicated, very skilled, very young, in part because they are able to, you know, communicate in ways that many of us would not be, using emojis and GIFs and so forth. Our knowledge base, the content of it is not proprietary, so we are willing to share any insights we have, and also some of the specific answers and the way we phrase the answers and deliver them.
Likewise, it's worth noting we have a full campaign library now, Tim, where we've shared all of the RCT proven nudges, but also as a bunch more campaigns, and we'll be populating it regularly, and any partner can just take them, modify them, and send them out, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's another question, Tim, about the buy-in process on campus, how you went about getting organizational readiness for this project.
Well, I'll say one of the key tools for buy-in is on this call. You know, Lindsay has been critical in buy-in. You think about who our audience is in trying to convince people to embrace something new that may cost a little money up front. And it's faculty, it's staff and administrators. It's a tough group, and it's a group that, you know, doesn't sway easily. And so one of our strategies, and Lindsay is a prime example, but we've deployed it before, is to collect the data, make sure the data is vetted independently, and bring that data back to the campus. So we talked about our use of Pounce for Summer Melt. That was actually a fairly concise project, right? We launched late spring, and the project was over by the end of August as classes were beginning at Georgia State. And Lindsay was already producing RCT data a couple months after that, and then publishing that data. So one way to buy-in is to do exactly what this whole webinar is about, which is respect the evidence and use the random control trial method to bring that back. If there's any audience out there that is swayed by convincing, well-conducted research, it should be our campuses, which are, you know, a lot of PhDs and others who have gone through educational training, so they really should appreciate and accept it. The other, you know, simple tip is just communicate. Have somebody represent these projects and go out and promote them. You know, the president and others are not going to care about this little thing going on unless he's given some reason to care about it. In our case, it is a he. You know, President Becker became a big supporter of this initiative, in part because we shared the data and we showed how it was positively impacting students. And once you get your president or chancellor to be a mouthpiece for these initiatives, a lot of the hard work is already behind you.
Thank you, Tim. I think given the interest of time, and I know everyone has a busy schedule, we will wrap up. If anyone has additional questions, I know we didn't get to all of them, we will follow up with all questions after the fact. If you have questions for any of us individually, obviously here are email addresses. This has been a wonderful hour. Thank you, Tim and Lindsay, for years of amazing partnership and sharing your time and insights. This has been wonderful. My infinite gratitude.
My pleasure. Thank you, Drew.
Happy to join. Yep.
All right. We will see you all at the next RCT announcement. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.